So greetings everyone and welcome to the 2025 Minx Auerbach Lecture in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Louisville. I'm Dr. Shelbi Pumphrey, Assistant Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Pan-African Studies here at U of L. As many of you know, the Auerbach Lecture was started in 1998 to commemorate the life of Minx Auerbach, a civic leader who was the first woman to serve as chair of the U of L Board of Trustees. Funded by a generous donation from Cy Auerbach, the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department has hosted numerous dynamic scholar activists, including Beverly Guy-Sheftall, Dorothy Roberts, and Cherie Moraga. I would like to take a moment to thank the Auerbach family who are here with us this evening. Thank you for your continued support for this important lecture series. I'd also like to thank the members of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department here at U of L for their support, especially Chairperson Dr. Dawn Heineken and Administrative Specialist Jan Rayburn. Our speaker for this evening follows in the tradition of past Auerbach keynotes. Dr. Shelbi Meissner is Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, and is the co-founder of the Indigenous Futures Lab and the Decolonizing Deaf Cafe. During an informal lunch with faculty and students earlier today, Dr. Meissner reminded us that the political uncertainty that we face is simply a replay of what has happened before. It may look different, but our community and our ancestors have survived moments like this before, and with their help, we will survive again. Her work is both ancestral and innovative, and always finds community and kinship at the center. She is a community-engaged scholar activist whose scholarship and teaching can provide guidance, solace, and affirmation during these times. Please join me in offering a warm University of Louisville welcome to Dr. Shelbi Meissner.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to begin by introducing myself in my ancestral language. Miyam notong Shelbi Nahwilet Meissner yaka no onatach pikwim kawish no piwi no yopoka nashmal chokya paonga neshkin no on shushavet ipit akan Washington D.C. nga Piscataway nga Maryland nga. I've just introduced myself in Luiseño, or Atachom Pomtela, the language of my ancestors, which is a knowledge-sharing protocol in lots of indigenous communities. I'm really, really grateful to be here and to have this opportunity to share with you all. A structure does not have to be old to feel inevitable. Some forms of power are built over centuries, woven into the foundations of nations, carved into landscapes, naturalized through generations of discipline. Others arrive suddenly, displacing what came before them, imposing new rhythms, new expectations, and new systems of control. The pendulum is not new. It was not always here. It was not part of the lands and lifeways that have sustained indigenous nations since time immemorial. It was brought here, imposed on this continent alongside the logics of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. And like all colonial structures, it was introduced violently, severing relations, replacing existing governance systems with something unfamiliar, unnatural, and imposed. The pendulum is a mechanism of rule, swinging between overt repression and the illusion of care, between abandonment and intervention, between criminalization and inclusion. When it moves one way, it tightens its grip through exclusion, through punishment, through logics of elimination. When it moves the other way, it loosens, but never fully releases, offering protections that are conditional, partial, and always vulnerable to reversal. And yet, despite its force, indigenous feminisms have never stood beneath it. We were here before the pendulum. Our governance systems, our kinship networks, our ways of knowing and relating did not need this colonial machinery to exist. We have always built worlds outside of its cycle. And while we are often forced to enter its shadow, to fight for our people, to protect what we can that's within its reach, we have never mistaken it for the source of justice. Other resistant epistemologies have also pre-existed or escaped the pendulum's logic. Black feminisms have long identified the ways the state expands and contracts its control, shifting between forms of violence that maintain racial capitalism. Ecofeminists have refused the state's artificial hierarchies, rejecting the mechanistic, extractive worldview that sees both women and land as sites of domination rather than sources of knowledge. Many of you may already be standing outside of this pendulum. This talk is not meant to convince you to join us, because that is a much longer epistemological journey, one that requires unlearning, deep relationality, and a shift in one's fundamental understanding of power. Instead, what I want to make clear is this. Regardless of whether the pendulum swings right or left, the land is in grave danger, and so are Indigenous bodies. Each time the pendulum moves, it demands our attention. It tells us that its direction is what matters most, that our energy must be spent either resisting its swing toward fascism or pushing it toward social democracy. But while all eyes are on the machine, something else is happening beneath it. The land is suffering. The most marginalized are suffering. Because the pendulum was never designed to protect either. Take Roe v. Wade, one of the most frequently cited examples of the pendulum's leftward swing. For many, its passage marked progress, an expansion of bodily autonomy, a moment when reproductive justice seemed within reach. But who was protected? Certainly not Indigenous women. For decades after Roe, Indigenous women were still being coerced into sterilization in federally funded Indian Health Service hospitals, often without their knowledge or consent. The same government that nominally supported abortion access was at the same time violating Indigenous reproductive autonomy on a massive scale. The leftward swing did not protect us, it simply stabilized the system. And neither did Roe protect the land. In the decades following its passage, the same government that defended the legal right to abortion also deregulated environmental protections, expanded fossil fuel extraction, and deepened its commitment to industrial development that poisoned native lands, waters, and bodies. The illusion of progress was just that, an illusion. What does it mean when the pendulum swings left but Indigenous women remain unprotected? What does it mean when the pendulum swings left but land continues to be poisoned, extracted, and exploited? It means that the machine is still intact. The rightward swing of the pendulum is devastating. It is violence made visible, the stripping away of rights, the hardening of borders, the criminalization of survival. It is worse for everyone but the settler elite. The leftward swing is not liberation, though. It does not stop the machine, it prevents revolt. It stabilizes institutions, it offers just enough relief to ensure that the system remains intact. And those who are most vulnerable, Indigenous people, Black communities, disabled and undocumented people, are still left at the margins, still targeted, still abandoned. This is why Indigenous feminisms do not seek to push the pendulum in one direction or another. Instead, we step outside of it. We refuse to limit our struggle to the terms it offers. The refusal of the pendulum is not passivity. It is not standing still in the face of oppression. It is not retreat. It is not detachment. It is stepping onto different ground entirely. It is choosing to orient toward land rather than the machinery of the state. It is choosing kinship over hierarchy. It is choosing relation over control. Indigenous feminisms do not seek to push the pendulum. They seek to dismantle the structure that holds it in motion. This is the political project of refusal, of Indigenous governance that does not need the state's permission to exist. To refuse the pendulum is also not to abandon struggle. It is to change the terrain upon which the struggle takes place. And so the question is not how hard we must push. The question is what happens when we stop pushing altogether, step outside of its path, and begin building worlds that have always been possible beyond its reach. The settler state has never been a singular force. It does not flow in one direction, nor does it rely solely on brute force. Instead, it oscillates, offering care with one hand and violence with the other, extending rights only to retract them later, regulating the most vulnerable under the guise of protection before abandoning them entirely. This oscillation is not random. It follows a historical pattern, a strategic rhythm of expansion and contraction. When pressure mounts, when resistance grows, the state expands carcerality, offering reforms, funding social programs, widening access to legal protections. But these are not structural changes. They are temporary concessions designed to prevent full-scale upheaval. When the state no longer sees these concessions as necessary, it shifts to carcerality, withdrawing services, gutting protections, and tightening its grip on those who had once been included. This is the function of the pendulum and is one of the defining features of US governance. The Reconstruction era saw the extension of civil rights and citizenship to Black men, only for Jim Crow segregation and racial terror to take its place. The civil rights movement forced desegregation and voting protections, but was followed by mass incarceration and dismantling of social welfare. The 1970s feminist legal gains around reproductive rights and workplace protections were soon countered by neoliberal austerity, the criminalization of abortion, and the gutting of social programs. Now we are once again experiencing the full weight of a rightward swing. Voting rights are being threatened in several states, undoing decades of hard-fought protections. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are being dismantled in universities and workplaces, erasing alleged commitments to racial and gender justice. Reproductive rights are being stripped away as abortion bans criminalize not only providers, but pregnant people themselves. Carcerality has overtaken carcerality. The pretense of care is collapsing, and with it, the illusion that the settler state was ever invested in protection. One of the clearest shifts between carcerality and carcerality is in welfare and social services, where state assistance has long functioned as a tool of regulation rather than relief. Carcerality does not eliminate poverty, it manages it. Federal programs such as TANF were explicitly designed to police the behavior of poor mothers, disproportionately targeting Black and Indigenous women with invasive requirements, work mandates, and surveillance. Food assistance programs such as SNAP are heavily restricted, requiring recipients to comply with complex eligibility rules that exclude many of the most vulnerable families. But under carcerality, even these conditional forms of support disappear. The expiration of the 2021 child tax credit expansion pushed an estimated 3.7 million children back into poverty within a year. The SNAP benefits were cut nationwide, forcing millions of families to reduce meals or rely only on food banks, which are themselves at capacity. The federal government has dramatically reduced funding for Native housing, education, and healthcare, citing budget concerns while simultaneously expanding military and policing budgets. One of the clearest examples of how carcerality disguises carcerality is the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. Passed in 1978 in response to the mass removal of Indigenous children from their families, ICWA was widely celebrated as a major victory in Native rights. But ICWA did not end the settler state's control over Native children, it simply changed the terms of that control. Even with ICWA in place, Native children are still removed at disproportionately high rates. They make up less than 1% of the US child population, but nearly 3% of children in foster care. State agencies continue to justify removals by citing neglect, a vague legal category that often criminalizes poverty rather than addressing its root causes. Now, ICWA itself is under attack, with its protections being challenged at the federal level. If it is overturned, Indigenous children will once again be fully subject to the settler legal system, with little to no recourse for their communities. Reproductive control has always been a key site of state power over Indigenous and Black communities. But the mechanisms of that control have shifted over time, from forced sterilization to coerced contraception, from the restriction of reproductive health care to the outright criminalization of pregnancy itself. Under carcerality, reproductive governance is framed as health care, but remains deeply entangled with state violence. Between the 1960s and 1980s, thousands of Indigenous women were sterilized without consent in federally funded Indian Health Service hospitals. Black and Latina women were disproportionately subjected to long-acting reversible contraceptive programs, often as a condition of receiving welfare or avoiding criminal charges. Now, under carcerality, the state is criminalizing reproductive autonomy outright. Abortion bans have been passed in 26 states, with some states enacting near total prohibitions, with no exceptions for rape, incest, or the health of the pregnant person. Pregnant people in states with abortion bans have already been denied life-saving medical care, leading to a sharp increase in preventable deaths from pregnancy-related complications. And these laws do not apply equally. Indigenous women have long faced systemic barriers to abortion access, with IHS hospitals prohibiting the procedure except in cases of rape or life endangerment, forcing many to travel hundreds of miles for care if that's even an option. Black women in the US experience maternal mortality rates nearly 3 times higher than white women, a direct result of racist medical neglect and systemic inequalities in healthcare access. This is not an anomaly, it is the inevitable outcome of carcerality's expansion. The criminal legal system has never functioned as a site of protection for marginalized community. It has only ever expanded its reach, shifting its targets while maintaining its core function of state control. Survivors of domestic violence are now being criminalized for self-defense, with Indigenous and Black women receiving harsher sentences for protecting themselves than their abusers receive for assault. Pregnant people who miscarry or experience stillbirth are being prosecuted for fetal homicide, with cases emerging in Texas, Alabama, and South Carolina. This is not a malfunction of the system, it's its logical endpoint. The illusion of care has collapsed, the state no longer needs to pretend. We are not witnessing a new form of oppression, we are witnessing a historical pattern repeating itself. The question is not how to return to carcerality, though. The question is how to refuse the pendulum altogether. If governance is only understood as something human-made, then the pendulum of settler power appears to be the only possible structure for organizing life. But Indigenous feminisms insist on a different starting point. Governance does not originate with the state, it is rooted in the land itself. This is a fundamentally different epistemological and ontological orientation. The settler state constructs governance as hierarchical, a system of laws imposed on people, land, and non-human beings, enforced through institutions of control. Indigenous governance, by contrast, is relational. It emerges from responsibilities rather than rights, from an ethics of care rather than a framework of punishment, from obligations to land and kin rather than obedience to an abstract legal entity. To step outside of the pendulum is not only to critique state power, it is to recognize that the state's way of thinking is only one among many possible ways of knowing, being, and relating to the world. This section turns to 3 key sites of Indigenous feminist world building: land as governance, kinship networks as accountability systems, and the construction of alternative futures beyond the state. These are not merely political strategies, but ontological refusals, ways of being and knowing that do not require state recognition to be legitimate. Land as governance, not a resource. The state understands land as something passive, something to be controlled, extracted from, divided, and owned. Even its most progressive legal frameworks still assume land as an object rather than a relation. But for Indigenous peoples, land is not only a home, nor simply a source of sustenance, it is a legal, political, and epistemological authority in its own right. The land does not require legislation to be meaningful, it is already a structure of law and governance. The law does not require recognition to be powerful, it is already a source of knowledge and survival. The land does not require human ownership, it is already a network of reciprocal relations. Indigenous feminist thought recognizes that the land is both a teacher and a sovereign entity, holding knowledge systems that predate and outlast colonial legal orders. In many Indigenous traditions, land is not simply material, it is also an intelligence, a consciousness, a living relation. This is what some scholars call ontological pluralism, the recognition that different beings, including the land itself, have their own ways of knowing and acting in the world. To live in relation to land, then, is not just to protect it as an object, it is to be in conversation with it, to recognize its agency, to understand its governance. The salmon knows when to return. The soil knows when it has been overworked. The river knows when it has been poisoned. Yet settler law does not recognize these intelligences as political forces. It does not listen to the land as an epistemic authority. Instead, it treats land as a neutral space, a commodity to be managed. Indigenous defenders refuse this framework. Land-based governance in practice, Indigenous feminist alternatives to the settler state. To step outside the pendulum is not to retreat from governance, but to reclaim it. Indigenous feminisms do not frame governance as something granted by the state, nor do they accept the colonial premise that law must be imposed from above, through hierarchy, punishment, or bureaucracy. Rather, governance emerges from relation between people, lands, and non-human kin. It is not a structure of control, but a network of reciprocal responsibilities, maintained not by the state, but by the obligations Indigenous nations have always carried toward their homelands, waterways, and one another. This is a fundamental and epistemological divergence from the settler state's understanding of governance. The state conceives of land as an object to be administered, managed, and exploited, whether for capitalist development, conservation, or state-recognized indigenous governance frameworks like tribal governments operating within federal legal structures. Indigenous feminist movements refuse this framework entirely. For them, land is neither passive nor a mere resource. It is an active legal, political, and epistemic agent. Land does not need state recognition to be sovereign. Indigenous feminist land-based movements demonstrate that governance is not merely resistance to state violence, but a practice of world building that exceeds the state's authority altogether. The following examples illustrate how land-based governance is enacted through direct material refusals of settler jurisdiction, asserting indigenous legal and political structures through presence, healing, sustenance, and relational accountability. In Secwepemc territory, the Tiny House Warriors movement exemplifies how indigenous feminist governance functions as a material practice, not simply a legal argument. Led by Secwepemc women, this movement is framed as more than a blockade against the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It's an assertion of jurisdiction, relational governance, and land-based responsibility. Settler legal frameworks insist that jurisdiction is tied to state authority, that Canadian law determines what happens on Indigenous lands. The Tiny House Warriors refuse this premise entirely, building homes directly on the path of the pipeline to reaffirm that Secwepemc law, not Canadian law, governs Secwepemc territory. Unlike forms of occupation which claim land through force, this occupation is framed through indigenous governance principles. Presence is not merely a legal strategy, but a relationship enacted through care, kinship, and land stewardship. By choosing to construct homes rather than barricades, the movement makes clear that this is not about a singular environmental or legal battle, but about sustaining permanent indigenous presence and relational belonging outside of state mediation. This is a direct challenge to the foundational logic of settler sovereignty, which depends on the idea that state recognition is necessary for legitimacy. Secwepemc law exists regardless of Canadian recognition. The land, in its context, is not a resource to be managed, it is an active participant in governance. Similarly, the Unistoten camp, established by Wet'suwet'en people in what is currently called Canada, similarly refuses the state's legal authority over Indigenous lands, but does so through a framework that explicitly ties governance to healing rather than punishment. Rather than engaging with Canadian law on its own terms, Unistoten camp operates as a reoccupation of Wet'suwet'en territory, where Wet'suwet'en law is practiced without seeking state approval. Governance in this context is structured through an ethic of repair and relational accountability, not through settler legal frameworks of crime and punishment. At Unistoten, the practice of governance includes a healing center where Indigenous people affected by colonial violence, whether through addiction, incarceration, or forced displacement, come to recover in relationship with the land. This camp also operates as a site for legal and political education, where Wet'suwet'en youth and community members are trained in traditional governance structures, land stewardship, and the assertion of Indigenous jurisdiction. This stands in direct contrast to settler legal orders, which frame governance as a function of courts, police, and punitive enforcement. The Unistoten model refuses this. Governance here is not about managing populations or criminalizing harm, but about reestablishing relationships of care and responsibility between people, between generations, and between humans and the land. If governance is understood as the structuring of relationships of law, sustenance, and care, then food sovereignty must be understood as a core element of Indigenous legal and political authority as well. The White Earth Land Recovery Project in Anishinaabe territory demonstrates how land-based governance is enacted through the reclamation of Indigenous food systems, the restoration of ecological balance, and the assertion of sovereignty over sustenance. Unlike state conservation efforts, which frame land protection through settler environmental policy legal categories like protected lands or national parks, the White Earth Land Recovery Project rejects the idea that land can be separated from the people who sustain it. Instead, it enacts a governance model in which land is neither resource nor commodity but relation, a site of reciprocal obligations where human survival is inseparable from the well-being of plants, water, and non-human kin. This project explicitly rejects capitalist food systems which rely on settler agricultural frameworks that sever the relationship between land and governance. Instead, it revives traditional Anishinaabe foodways, particularly wild rice harvesting, which is not merely an economic practice, but a legal, ceremonial, and ecological structure in itself. The governance of food is the governance of land, and the governance of land is the governance of people. Through food sovereignty, the White Earth Land Restoration Project demonstrates that Indigenous political authority is enacted not through appeals to the state, but through the continuity of life-sustaining practices. These three movements I've described do not merely oppose settler extraction and violence, they enact alternatives that make the settler state's claim to jurisdiction increasingly irrelevant. They do not ask permission to exist. They do not frame their legitimacy through legal recognition by colonial governments. Instead, they demonstrate what governance looks like when land rather than the state is the primary legal authority. Settler laws do not recognize the land as an epistemic force. It does not acknowledge that the land knows, that it remembers, and that it holds obligations for those who live with it. But Indigenous feminist movements make clear that land-based governance is not a metaphor, it is a practice. The land already governs, the land already holds law. Indigenous feminist movements do not seek to reform the settler state to acknowledge this. They act in relation to the law of the land itself, refusing the pendulum entirely. This is what governance looks like. This is what governance looks like outside the state. This is what power looks like beyond the cycle of inclusion and exclusion. This is the world that has always been possible and is already in motion. The settler state defines governance through isolation, punishment, and deterrence, a structure premised on the idea that harm is best addressed through incarceration, separation, and state control. The prison industrial complex, child welfare system, and policing apparatus all function under the assumption that order must be imposed, that wrongdoing must be met with exclusion, and that justice is best administered through confinement and surveillance. Yet, as Indigenous and Black feminists have long argued, the state does not repair harm, it reproduces it. The very institution tasked with ensuring safety are themselves engines of violence, extracting people from their communities, criminalizing survival, and eliminating pathways to accountability outside of carceral logic. To turn to the state for justice is to ask a colonial structure to dismantle itself, an impossibility when its very existence depends on maintaining hierarchy and dispossession. Indigenous feminisms insist on a radically different understanding of justice, one not rooted in policing and punishment, but in kinship, accountability, and relational governance. This is not simply a social structure, nor is it reducible to biological or nuclear family formations. Rather, kinship is a political system in itself, a structure that determines responsibility, distributes obligation, and enforces accountability through reciprocal relations rather than coercion. Kinship-based governance ensures that no one is discarded, no one is disappeared, and no one is placed beyond the reach of care and accountability. The difference is a matter of worldview. Where the settler state isolates, kinship integrates. Where the settler state punishes, kinship holds accountable. Where the settler state criminalizes survival, kinship ensures it. This is why both Indigenous feminisms and Black feminisms have long been in deep theoretical and practical alignment. Both traditions recognize that justice cannot be outsourced to the state because the state is incapable of providing it. Both traditions reject the notion that justice must be delivered through punitive retribution rather than collective responsibility. And both have built alternative structures of safety, care, and accountability that refuse the logic of policing, incarceration, and state-mediated punishment. I'm going to end by gesturing at a few really phenomenal organizing movements. The first one is Survived and Punished, a project in the United States that embodies the core of Black feminist abolitionist theory. The criminalized survivors of gendered violence are not aberrations of the justice system, but its predictable victims. Many of the women and queer people incarcerated in the US are there not because they committed harm, but because they survived it. Incarcerated for defending themselves, for criminalized survival strategies, or for resisting the conditions that made them vulnerable to violence in the first place. Rather than appealing to a legal system for reform, Survived and Punished builds an alternative structure of justice through kinship, coalition, and abolitionist defense campaigns. Their work includes freeing incarcerated survivors, organizing mutual aid, and developing political education about how the criminal legal system itself produces the conditions of gendered violence rather than preventing them. By foregrounding relational accountability and survivor autonomy, this work refuses the idea that justice requires more policing, prosecution, and imprisonment. This is kinship as governance, not as a metaphor, but as an operational legal structure in which care replaces confinement and collective responsibility replaces state control. Another example is the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement, which is often misunderstood as a demand for greater state intervention, more policing, harsher sentencing, and stronger federal oversight. But Indigenous feminist organizers have consistently rejected this framing, instead arguing that carceral responses to gendered violence only expand the power of the settler state while failing to address the root causes of the harm. Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people are disproportionately harmed by state and interpersonal violence, not because the state is failing to act, but because it was never designed to protect them. Law enforcement agencies which routinely ignore missing and murdered Indigenous women's cases are often the very institutions perpetrating the violence, whether through police sexual violence, the criminalization of Indigenous survival, or the refusal to intervene in cases involving white perpetrators. In response, Indigenous feminists have developed kinship-based safety networks that do what the settler legal system has never done: protect Indigenous people on Indigenous terms. These models recognize that safety does not come from the state, it comes from the relationships we sustain with each other and with the land. And the final example are Indigenous mutual aid networks, which have long functioned as governance structures outside the state, operating through kinship obligations rather than charity or state dependency. Mutual aid is not just about redistribution of resources, it's a governance system that ensures community survival in the absence or direct violence of the state. Mutual aid is an ancestral practice, not a new political formation. In contexts where the state has intentionally produced conditions of scarcity, whether through food displacement, land theft, or economic exclusion, mutual aid networks function as alternative economies that refuse settler capitalist dependency. We see this in food sovereignty initiatives, houselessness response efforts, disaster relief networks. These networks do what the state refuses to do: ensure survival in ways that are not conditional, not punitive, and not reliant on state recognition. The state's pendulum does not account for the land as a force of law, knowledge, and relation. It does not recognize Indigenous women and Two-Spirit kin as governance leaders. It does not acknowledge the abolitionist world building that Black and Indigenous communities have carried forward for generations. The state was never meant to be a source of justice, and it never will be. The land has already shown us what justice requires. Indigenous feminisms do not seek to push the pendulum in either direction, because to do so would be to remain caught within its rhythm. Instead, the work is to step outside of it entirely, to return what has always existed beyond the reach of the state, to refuse its authority over our futures, and to reclaim what has never belonged to it. The land has never needed the state to survive, and neither have we. The knowledge that sustained my work predates the settler state and will outlast it. In closing, I want to acknowledge that the land we are on, which has governed itself long before any colonial structure claimed dominion over it. I want to recognize the Indigenous peoples of this place, past, present, and future, whose ways of knowing, organizing, and resisting continue despite centuries of displacement and erasure. I want to honor the Black communities of Louisville, whose histories of resistance, survival, and world building have shaped this place in ways that the state refuses to acknowledge. I stand within a long line of thinkers, organizers, and knowledge keepers who have always understood that another way of living is not only possible, but already in motion. If history is only understood through the cycles of the settler state, it may seem as though we are caught in an endless pattern of expansion and contraction, of brief relief followed by even greater repression. But Indigenous feminisms, Black feminisms, abolitionist world building, and land-based governance have never moved according to that cycle. We were never meant to push the pendulum. We have always known how to step outside of it. Thank you.
right, so now we have some time for question and answer. So if folks have any questions and want to just raise their hand, then I will come around with a microphone. Okay? Anyone at all? Question. Perfect.
Could you talk again about the labs and how that came about, and share that again? You shared it this morning at lunch, but if you wouldn't mind sharing it with other people here tonight.
About my lab?
Yeah, everything that you do.
Yes,
the activism.
okay. Sure. So at University of Maryland, I am an assistant professor in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And I have been there for 1 year, and we have made the Indigenous Futures Lab. It's only 1 year old, but we have done so many amazing things and built so many amazing relationships with our communities. We have several different projects, one of which is the Decolonizing Death Collective, which you see the Instagram handle for. This is a space for Indigenous, Black, and mostly anti-colonial, anti-racist death care workers to be able to virtually gather from places all over the world. I think we have 65 members, and it's just been really amazing to hear how much work and how much isolation and alienation people who do that work feel. And so this network, I think, is really important for connecting folks around that. We're putting together a symposium for this winter, so hopefully I'll be able to share some of that with you all. We also have the Bead Weave and Read, which is a weekly. It was supposed to be monthly. It was supposed to happen once a month, but the students loved it so much that it became a weekly thing, just entirely based on their force of will. So it's a weekly thing now, and we have weekly gatherings around some kind of teaching. Specifically this semester, we're working on sewing, but the semester beforehand, we had worked on basket weaving, where we brought in practitioners of different basket weaving traditions to teach the students, as well as some of our students served as teachers. And it was this really exciting moment for me as a nerdy epistemologist to watch that sort of haptic knowledge exchange that oftentimes isn't verbal, it oftentimes isn't written down. It's a type of sharing and knowing that happens with your hands and your body in community. So it's been so cool to watch this happen literally every Friday at my lab. So that's some of the things we've been doing. We're building a lot of partnerships with local community activists. We are putting together home and community syllabi where people can take these coursework books to their communities and work through them together around different social justice avenues. And yeah, it's just the sky's the limit. I can't believe we've done so much in a year, but shout out to all of the amazing folks at the lab.
Let me just. Excuse me, sorry. Here you are, Keisha.
Oh my goodness. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Meissner, for your time. I'm going to try to wrap my head around this question. I appreciate your time, and so I'm thinking a lot about, I guess it would be these epistemologies of time and how you, through your activism and also through this framework of Indigenous feminisms, and thank you so much for speaking to how they've been in conversation with Black feminisms, because I'm always thinking about that concept of time in our bodies in this context of the settler colonial state. And in that, I'm thinking a lot about transnationalism, and thank you for including the representations in and around feminism as a transnational moment, Indigenous feminisms, Black indigeneity, right? And that moment with Lucas, who I know through their work, through Mushe connections, right, through Oaxaca. So I'm just going to leave it at that. If you could talk about time. Thank you so much.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked this. It's not a coincidence that at the beginning, the pendulum that I'm obsessed with is a watch, because a lot of this started when I got very upset about daylight savings time, which messes me up every single year. I grew up in Arizona where we didn't have it, and so now that I have to deal with it every year, I'm just like, how do people act like this is normal? Like, why is everybody like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed? Like, this is affecting my body. This is affecting like the land. And I remember I had this conversation with an elder when I was in graduate school where he had mentioned that, isn't it wild that we just listen to the government about what time it is? We listen to the government about what should be harvested and when. We respond to these, arbitrary and sometimes extremely artificial ways of describing our realities that are not tied to one that we've seen all the time. So the land knows what time it is, my body knows what time it is, the sun knows what time it is, but when you look at your watch, you're like, oh, never mind, gaslighting me out of what I think I know, so I guess that's what time it is. But yes, I think it's like, that's silly, but it's also like a actually huge ontological shift that happens, kind of historically in lots of different communities where we stop looking to the land and we start looking to kings or leaders, monarchs to tell us what should be harvested, how the land should be treated, how it should be divided up, instead of listening to what the land has been telling us all along. So time is something I'm running out of, I feel like, for some reason, but also something that I feel like in the United States, there's a lot of like settler colonial tricks around time, where somehow settler colonial like history courses will make it seem like America has always existed. There has never been any alternatives, and like this is it. We can't think outside of it. But then there's also this idea that like it will never end and it somehow never began. Like there's a lot of tendency to bury or to hide the origin stories of people who have come to the United States as settlers, people who somehow, left oftentimes Europe and then don't have any story of how that happened. And then we get these really strange replacements of those stories about things like, oh, my great-great-grandmother is a Cherokee princess, or, oh, the wagon broke here and that's why we live here now. Like, these are really strange origin stories made to replace the ones that are real. So there's no beginning and there's no end, and that's quite a paradox, I think, of time, and quite obviously not true. So I think about time a lot. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It's really wonderful. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the food movements with sovereignty. Yeah.
Yes. So food sovereignty, I think, is something that is a lot more radical than it sounds, in that sometimes people might think of food sovereignty as a movement around like, oh, this is a delicious and healthy thing that we used to eat, so we should have it again. And at some level, that is what it is. But there's also like a deep connection to like land rematriation and the land back movement around what it would mean to be in control of one's food, what it would mean to be in good relation with a land such that it produces the food. Oftentimes people have me come in and consult. They're like, we want a Three Sisters garden. And I'm like, do you mean you want to grow corn, beans, and squash together? That's not the same thing as a Three Sisters garden. A Three Sisters garden is something that's built around like an entire soil and water system that is in balance and cohesion with one another, one that's treated well and then in return treats us well. But a small plot with the corn, beans, and squash is great, and learning about companion planting, but that's not the same thing as what like food sovereignty requires of the movements. So I've seen a lot of amazing food sovereignty work in California around water management and around fire management for in California, what you hear about fire is usually that they're like tearing down the forests, but the traditional way of managing those lands was to use controlled burns. And so there are lots of people who are trying to bring back these traditions of controlled burns, because the relationship between fire actually keeps the water clean, and the water being clean and flowing through the meadows correctly makes it so that we have more acorns, and acorns is what we eat to survive. So there's like a whole big system of like repatriation that exists, I think, underneath something that maybe doesn't sound as radical as it is. But I also think that's used really strategically. So pretend I didn't say that part about the secret radicality of food sovereignty.
I love the lecture, and I'm just wondering how we can include city dwellers into the spirit of it, I guess.
City dwellers as in like people who live in cities? So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around where Indigenous people are. Oftentimes people think that Indigenous people are like in rural spaces or like living in the forest. I don't know what people think, but they don't know that most Indigenous people live in cities, that in any state, usually the highest concentration of Native people is going to be in the cities. And that in the cities is where we see these really amazing Black and feminist like urban restoration projects or gardening projects or mutual aid projects, childcare projects. So I think that, I think of the city really as kind of the location for so much of this work, more so than I think of like being out on the res or being, somewhere in a rural space. I think that urban Indigenous communities oftentimes aren't accounted for in the way we think about activism, but that they are very much at the core of, those legacies in every city. So I moved just recently to Maryland, and a lot of my work is in Baltimore. And Baltimore has this amazing history of organizing from, Native people all the way back to the American Indian movement and before that. And it's just so wild to see that like so many of the resources for Native people are kind of spread out into, tribal communities that are in the more like margins of the state and not toward the communities that are in Baltimore. So that's something that I hope to learn more about as I live there more, but I definitely think of the cities as the locations for this type of work.
You briefly mentioned ecofeminism at the beginning, and I was wondering, my question was, how can we incorporate ecofeminist principles into like community building and into our advocacy work in a way that, I guess that's my question.
I am not an expert on ecofeminisms. All I really know is that when I'm being looked at like I'm crazy by some people, the ecofeminists are not looking at me like I'm crazy. They're like, we got you, we completely understand what you're saying. There's this recognition of the land as a relative, a recognition of us as not individuals, as biomes that are in and out of each other's spaces. Like, I don't know, ecofeminists have always just been really cool. So I'm just like, I've got space for you, you've got space for me. And so I think a lot of the work of coalition building, when it does involve, feminists that are not coming from Black and Indigenous traditions, that the ecofeminists are, I think, natural allies in a certain sense, but that there's also like a whiteness that can be at the core of that I think doesn't become as much of a problem once the land is really established as a relative and really established as something that we're all working to be in balance with. So I hope that I see more ecofeminists. I think it's like out of fashion right now, but I hope it comes back. Yay, I'm glad.
Okay, hi. We talked about a lot today, and I enjoyed that. But I'm trying to be intentional on how I say this. But when you talk about the progress of these movements and how people reconnect with their ancestry and their land and stuff, it's beautiful, but this is not an ideal world. And there's a common theme of like, when making this progress, there's always that retaliation against that. But I guess I wanted to ask if you could share more just about how like Indigenous persons develop those systems of resilience to ensure that like these traditions and these practices weren't erased, and like how they kind of had to reconfigure things in order to ensure the survival of that.
Yes, I think that there are so many different strategies we see from so many different communities that I don't want to like overgeneralize. But one of the things that I've seen that in my own family and in my own community is the use of colonial tools to preserve Indigenous like languages or teachings or stories, like kind of secretly for safekeeping, and then hoping that another generation will come around and take it back out. And so that's why a lot of my work ends up in archives, where archives are colonial tools. But I've seen so many examples of my own ancestors, sneakily using these spaces as places to, put aside our songs, or put aside our prayers, or put aside our language. And I think that, yes, we then end up in these situations where young people have to enter into these colonial spaces like an archive. And how do we protect ourselves when we go into these spaces? How do we make sure our spirits are safe when we're going into a space when we don't know what kind of awful brutality we might encounter, or we don't know whose narrative about what happened to us might be the one that we run into? And so I think there's like a strength in being around other people who are doing that same thing and kind of bolstering your spirit and your medicines and your connections to your ancestors as you go into those spaces. Don't treat it like neutral research. Treat it like something that's dangerous and scary that you need to hold space for yourself in order to do. I think the same thing goes for some of the more clandestine ways of keeping our traditions secret and safe, which is secret societies or secret ceremonies. Sometimes that's the best way to go about it. So sometimes it's like using these colonial public tools in ways that are not necessarily how they were intended, and sometimes it's using very secret, very close to the chest tools for intergenerational knowledge transmission. But I think that's the most important part, is the intergenerational component, that you have elders and young people in the same space, and that people like me, who I always think I'm like approaching middle age. I don't think I am, but I am in a life stage where I'm like no longer a graduate student or an adolescent, but I'm like not quite like old, I guess. My students think I'm really old. Anyway, so I'm in this life stage where I see my responsibility as caretaking the knowledge transmission between elders and children. Elders and children are full of knowledge. I am in the part of my life where I want to set the table so that they can come together and share knowledge, because that's how our communities continue, is through that type of knowledge exchange.
Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking. And you started off with a wonderful critique of the state and its sort of inherent trend towards colonialism and violence. So I wonder what the implications are for governance, especially indigenous governance today in a post-colonial world. What are some of your thoughts around the governance we see in indigenous communities today?
Yes. Well, first, I don't think we are in a post-colonial world, not here at least. But second, a lot of there's a difference, I think, between governance and governments. So governments in a lot of indigenous communities are structured very similarly to the way that like the US structure is. So in a lot of ways, we see the same kinds of understandings of representation, the same kinds of understanding of what a constitution would be, and it's because they use these boilerplate constitutions when they form these federally recognized sovereign nations. And that is a wheelhouse that I tend to not work in as much, namely because it is very much a reiteration of that same colonial system. There are people doing amazing work from within that system, like indigenous people who do federal Indian law and then like go in like ready to fight. Like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. I was not built for that one. I was built for working in governance, which is around the theoretical components of building building understandings of law and justice and knowledge through our teachings and traditions outside of the state. So not outside of the state, and entering into the state for resources, or entering into the state for like a place, something to critique or to have an interlocutor with, but that ultimately we're trying to build our own traditions or rekindle our old traditions of knowledge transmission, of governance, of gender cosmologies, of language, all of which I think is connected to the land in a way that these ones actually never can be, because they're just reiterations of this same landless understanding of justice, if that makes sense.
I wanted to know if you found it difficult to engage in like rejections of politics of recognition while being so while having a necessity to have resources from these like state institutions and like having a lot of this knowledge that is held by them, and like essentially needing to utilize them, and then like in having to have them recognize you in that way, and like kind of it being maybe like paradoxical.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it is. it's a thing that used to bother me a lot more when I was younger because I was obsessed with being like the most politically pure and like decolonial badass of all time, and I couldn't possibly have any contradictions in my life. But again, now that I'm in a different life stage, I realize my skill set and my positionality and my privilege has me in a situation where I can siphon resources, or I can put people in connection with resources, or I can put people in connection with each other because I'm coming from a different vantage point than I was before. And I'm realizing, oh yeah, maybe this does look like a contradiction, but also I don't care because I'm getting the resources to the places that they need to go. And it's not about me as an individual or my reputation, as a decolonial badass. It's about like the intergenerational bucket brigade that I see myself as a part of, that I'm taking on, responsibilities that were left to me from my ancestors and leaving those for my ancestors to come. And this other part of it is that I have learned to not let my own self-worth or my own understanding of who I or my people are or my family is, not let that get wrapped up or confused with what their measuring stick for, success and merit is. Like, I can look at it from the outside and say, okay, I'm gonna jump into that role for today. It's called trickster hermeneutics. It's like one of my favorite things of all time, where you just jump into that role and you play it and you go through the things you need to go through, and then you jump out and wash it off after the end of the day. And it doesn't stick on me anymore, but it took a long time to learn how to take off the colonial people suit.
Excuse me. So, that's okay. We'll go this way. Here you go, Natalie. There you are.
Thank you very much. This is very thought-provoking, especially the Q&A. And my question isn't quite completely formulated in my brain. But I would like to know, I'm thinking of what would an Indigenous archive look like, a purely Indigenous archive where knowledge could be easily accessed and transmitted, discovered in a way that completely bypasses the colonial structure?
I like this question. I've thought about this question for a very long time. And one thing I think I have concluded is that there is no non-colonial archive, that the idea of collection in that sense comes from an imposed scarcity or an imposed, sense of, this ought to be collected because otherwise we won't know it. It comes with a particular understanding of knowledge, it comes with a particular understanding of the other, and it comes from a particular understanding of like why we preserve and what for because of scarcity or impending doom or whatever. That being said, I don't think that means there's no such thing as an Indigenous archive, because we don't live in an ideal world, and we are in a position where we need to be archiving our materials now because we are living in imposed scarcity. So when we think about how we look at Indigenous archival methods or Indigenous archival ethics, one of the things I'm really interested in is looking to governance from the land. And this is an example, I think answering your question as well, so I think about it, if an archive is supposed to be a place where a community can gather our resources and then redistribute them in ways that people might need them later on for, to know something about our languages, or to know something about our history, or know something about, who's allowed to gather acorns where. These are important things that might be in an archive. And so I was thinking, what have my ancestors done that is similar to this, that I could look to for guidance about how we would go about doing this now? And what came to mind immediately is the acorn granary. So the acorn granary is a way that California Indians and other acorn communities, a lot of California Indian names for themselves is acorn eater. So like acorns are really important in California. So I'm running around talking about acorns, it's not because I'm just making that up. I'm not crazy. I'm a California Indian. And so the acorn granaries are these huge baskets that are woven communally to store acorns. And those acorns can be stored for a very long time. It takes 1,000 pounds of acorns for one person to survive for 1 year. And our villages, of course, have a ton of people in them. So we need to store a ton of acorns. And so these acorn granaries become these really important, I think, fixtures in a community about how do we, as a community, gather our the things that are important for our survival? How do we come back and get them out of collections? How do we maintain them? How do we keep them safe? How do we decide who consume them? What do we do with them when we consume them? Are you making a delicious pudding? Or are you making, gross acorn squares? Like, there's all kinds of ways I see an analog there to archiving. So my thought was, what if the archive is an acorn granary? What if we go look at the acorn granaries as ways to learn about how to archive? So that project is underway. So I'm really excited. I hope it will be published soon.
Do we have any additional questions from anyone at all?
I'm just going to be a little self-indulgent. On the same vein as the ecofeminism and the land, you mentioned several times non-human inhabitants of the land. Would you consider talking a little bit more about that? Because as someone who studies animal studies, I do find I struggle sometimes to legitimize that to the state.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think it goes to that. Other Shelbi.
Other Shelbi.
I came from academic philosophy where I've never felt more like a crazy person than like a room full of those people looking at me being like, what are you talking about? What do you mean animals have feelings? Or what do you mean, this is your relative, the spider? Like, yeah. So I've been in that position of actually being inarticulable. Like, there's nothing I can do to make that make sense to somebody who comes from that worldview. And at that point, that burden is not really on me argumentatively, because we're not going to get done whatever it was that we were trying to get done. There might be times where I need to more strategically convince people. So then I will drop things like relative. I'll drop things like telling people that like rocks can tell us their names, or that we call the frog wahaukilai because it told us wahaukilai. It sounds like the ribbit. Like that, I can drop that out of the conversation when I'm writing a grant so that it sounds a little bit more palatable. But at the end of the day, I think that we're having really different conversations if people are starting from a hierarchical view of, this is man is on top and the land is down here, the microbes are down here, the critters that keep us alive are down here, and we're on top, and they're an other, and they are in relation to us such that we can use them or extract from them without being in relation. They're having a different conversation than you, and I don't know how to make that any less the case.
Are you involved with any groups that address those issues in the lab?
Yes. So we have an amazing group that was called the Black and Indigenous Climate Faculty Futures Fellowship, which is a terrible title, that has now become something called the Cedar Gallery, and their work is on showcasing all of the different amazing Black and Indigenous environmental movements around the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And there we see animal studies, we see feminist animal studies, we see people doing all kinds of amazing work with the concept of ecologies, what ecologies can mean, like, in biology versus in like your feminist theory classes, and how even though they sound like they're talking about different things, they're not. Like, it's a really, really amazing space. So we'll definitely make sure you get the links to their talks.
Is that all of our questions? All right. Well, please join me in giving Dr. Meissner another round of applause for a wonderful lecture.